the Journey Through Sci-Fi. My name is James.
And my name is Matt.
And today on the podcast, we are looking at enforcing the law. We are back talking about dystopias once again, but this time we are looking at law enforcement. And we've got a couple of, well, I think they're pretty classic cult films this week, haven't we, Matt?
Proper cult classics, a proper old cult classic from the days when cult classics were really rife, and a real modern cult classic, upsettingly 10 years old. That's gone by in the blink of an eye, but a film that rapidly became a cult classic. And was a bit of a box office flop, as most cult classics are.
Yeah, it didn't take long for that one to become a cult classic, did it? But the films we are talking about this week are Mad Max from 1979 and Dredd from 2012. 10 years ago, man, that's mad.
Yeah, 10 years already. We are hurtling into the future, and will it be the future of Mega City 1? We don't know yet. Time is yet to tell. But why is it so important to enforce the law in a dystopian society? That's what we're talking about today. It's the law enforcers, Max and Dredd, these larger-than-life cops. How have we seen this so far in the series in other dystopias?
Well, thinking about the previous episodes, the last kind of thing we saw with this kind of thing has been obviously Fahrenheit 451. We saw it in there. We saw it in Equilibrium. Those were properly sort of like law enforcement people. But it's a different kind of thing this time. The world is different in these two films. It's violent, full of anarchy. Things have gone to pot, haven't they, in the worst possible way.
Yeah, when we looked at Fahrenheit 451 and Equilibrium, we were looking at the idea of those law enforcers realizing that there was something wrong with the society they were trying to uphold and the laws that they were trying to uphold as law enforcers, and kind of turning against the dystopian society. That's not what we're going to see here in Mad Max and Dredd. We're very much, for the most part, as an audience, we're on side with their actions, and they are explicitly very, very violent actions. But I guess we will talk about the justifications in these films for those violent actions of these law enforcers.
Yeah, definitely. So shall we get into Mad Max then and get into this again, yet another violent chat on the podcast about dystopian films?
Yeah, let's start with Mad Max from 1979.
Tomorrow, in a world gone mad, the only law will be a renegade squad of suicidal cops.
He's my prisoner, and he's not walking out that door.
And the open road will be controlled by gangs of glory roaders.
They're very visceral, these two films. And I mean, Mad Max, just to kick things off, I think it was famed for the sort of a few scenes which happen in it, which are quite full on, aren't they?
Yeah, I'd say it borrows heavily from exploitation cinema. It is violent, silly, fun, low budget, and kind of just made on a wing and a prayer. You can kind of tell it's a really thrown together film from some passionate filmmakers, which adds to the fun, I think, definitely, the kind of low budgetness of it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it was like 350 grand in Australian dollars, whatever that works out in our currency over here, and America, if you're listening to America, or wherever indeed you are listening from. Yeah, it's a minute budget, and it earned millions at the box office. It just really raked it in, didn't it?
Yeah, it was the most profitable film ever made for a while. I'm assuming that Blair Witch and then later Paranormal Activity, and probably something even before Blair Witch, knocked it off that top spot. But it was one of the most profitable films ever made off its budget, which is, great. It's a shame Dredd couldn't recreate the same. But it's why it's got, Mad Max has gone on to have 3 sequels now, and its whole franchise. There's hopefully more in the pipeline. Because it made a ton of money, and it's quite an early example of a big breakout Aussie film, isn't it? I think, to my knowledge.
Yeah, it's not often that you talk about, we rarely talk about Australian cinema on this particular podcast. We did talk about it when we looked at Occupation Rainfall, and we chatted to Luke Spark about that. it's interesting Australian cinema because like this film is very true to Australia, isn't it, in a lot of ways. And for it to have sort of like spread to the masses, it felt like from what I gather, obviously I wasn't around when it first came out, but in 1979 when this film came out and started to sort of like break America and so on and so forth, it was a big moment for Australian cinema because like we said, it became a cult film, but it also drew attention to Australia. But sadly, like in America, apparently it was redubbed quite a lot of it. So they wanted to make sure that American audiences understood it, and all the actors were quite pissed off, as you would imagine, because like they've spent all this time acting in the film and it's taken off, but they're being redubbed. They said the actors basically said, "Oh, if we'd known that was going to happen, we would have just put on American accents." But obviously that wouldn't have been true to the actual film as it being an Australian made film. And yeah, but I found all of that really interesting, just looking at the sort of like palette for films at the time and how they felt the need to make it Americanized.
Yeah, yes, because it's that, again, kind of trading off that exploitation cinema. That's, I mean, there's exploitation cinema all over the world, but the kind of violent, low-budget B-movies, that's really an American product, I think. That's something I associate with American exploitation movies, and it's borrowing heavily from that. The accents are interesting in the movie. There's a lot of interesting voices. Obviously, most people sound Australian. It's set in Australia, but Gibson is... what's the deal with Mel Gibson? I think he's American, but I think he grew up in Australia or something like that. He has a bit of both going on. And the type of character that he's playing, the kind of... hardened warrior cop type guy is another kind of American trope, and he slipped into some quite American sounding noises when he's speaking. And then you've got Toe Cutter on the other side of it, the leader of the gang, the main antagonist, who has like really gorgeous, really interesting voice. He sounds quite posh, quite theatrical, and that's really important for Toe Cutter's character and the whole gang, the kind of theatricality. But yeah, his voice, he doesn't always sound Australian. He sounds like he's come from RADA, at times. But then he kind of like bounces back and forth with it. What Mel Gibson's doing and what Hugh Keays-Byrne is doing, I'd hate to see a dubbed version and not enjoy Toe Cutter's voice in all its glory.
Yeah, and it's interesting, sort of like the casting of Mel Gibson as well, because there was lots of like sort of work to make that happen as well, because he was sort of being, I think he was at some sort of drama school, obviously in Australia, and then he sort of got plucked out from a casting audition. But there were talks about getting an American to play Max in this as well at one point, and because Mel Gibson was such an unknown at the time as well, if you look at the poster for Mad Max, he's got this big helmet on, and it's sort of like the American poster. It's sort of like, it's very sort of comic bookized, if that's a proper word, but it's made to look like that, and it doesn't really translate into the film because like Mel Gibson's never really got a helmet on. It's completely sort of like different to what you see in the actual film itself. But in the Australian one, you've got Mel Gibson sort of like front and center in the poster. So it's interesting just sort of like the way they marketed it as well. And even the trailer sort of cut out a lot of Mel Gibson's parts. And even though he is Mad Max, they're focusing on all the violence and the sort of like action scenes and all these chase sequences. So yeah, all of that kind of stuff is interesting. Just looking at it now and looking at the star that Mel Gibson became, and then like obviously he's become a controversial character at the same time, but just going from that trajectory and then just starting out in this low budget sci-fi, which just did so much.
Yeah, and he's excellent in the film. He's really well cast, and it's a really good performance as well. He's so young. I don't know how old he was when this was made, but he's got a very boyish face, which is not something
Such a smooth face.
Yeah. And that's not something I associate with Mel Gibson. He's generally quite a rugged-looking man. The movie star that I grew up with anyway was, he was a lot older by the time I was seeing him in films. But yeah, he's got like a ruggedness to him. And to see him look so baby-faced, but it's perfect for Max in this film because he can go from you know, his introduction where he's got the sunglasses on, you can't see his eyes, and he's cool as a cucumber, and he doesn't enter the fray until all the other MFP officers have failed to catch Knight Rider, and then he's sent in and he's a badass and he's like playing chicken with them and all of that. But then to have the kind of like shock on his face, a childlike shock at seeing something really awful later on in the film, Gibson's able to do both in this movie, and it's brilliant. It works perfectly.
Like you said, it's weird seeing Mel Gibson so young, having seen him since and seeing where his career went. But what were your sort of like memories of this particular film as well? Because I think this first film is very different to what we know of the world of Mad Max, because in all of the subsequent sequels, it's a very different sort of world, isn't it?
Yeah, so we've mentioned this a little bit, I think, already, the kind of the tension between dystopian films and post-apocalyptic films. And I really think that the style and the tropes of the rest of this series are leaning more into post-apocalyptic films, where society's completely broken down and it's all just a kind of winner-takes-all, dog-eat-dog world in those films. Even though no real apocalyptic event happens, I don't think. Australia or the world runs out of petrol, and then society starts crumbling because of that. I think that's all that really happens. I can't remember too well.
I don't know if this is later in the other films, but it's kind of implied there's some sort of world war at some point, and then
a world war over oil, I think, as a resource, oil or petrol as a resource. I think.
And obviously all the oil stuff was reflecting what was happening in the 70s in Australia at the time, because they had that big oil crisis over there. So George Miller wanted this to be a film with those kind of things in it, because that was so prominent at the time, and it's sort of like it all fed into this. And I mean, it became this sci-fi dystopian world because of budget as well, because the places that they were shooting were really derelict, and they were sort of easier to get sort of like permission to shoot there because it's cheaper. So the sets sort of like influenced the story as well. So it all sort of like meshed into creating this world.
And I do wonder if there's like a slight hesitance in this film to lean too much into that futuristic setting because it wasn't the original intention. I don't know. It's certainly like the rest of the films pick that up and really like set it in what seems like a distant future. I mean, the very opening scroll on this is like, what is it? It's like a few years from now or something like that, it says. And maybe that wasn't like Miller's primary interest, so it's not like what he leaned into heavily in this film, but then he does much more so in the later films of the series.
Yeah, well, I mean, at one point it was originally going to be set in 70s Australia, so all of the story was going to reflect all of that kind of stuff. But I think it's much more interesting having it in this future dystopian world. And looking at this film in contrast to those sequels, you're seeing this world on the verge of collapse. We're not quite there yet. And I mean, that's what all of the dystopian films we've looked at so far have they've got that sort of thing about them. It's a world which is very close to now, and it's a world that if nothing changes, then it's going to collapse, and there's going to be like civilization will be over at that point. Whereas this is kind of like they're clinging on still. You've still got some sort of law enforcement, some sort of like justice system in there, and you've still got sort of good people, but there's something shady going on. Something is sort of on the horizon.
Yeah, the Mad Max films chart a breakdown of society. And the first film is set at the point in that timeline when the kind of the balance between, the power balance between the law enforcement officers, the MFP, and the street gangs is still like just about in favor of the MFP. And then by the time we get to Mad Max 2 and beyond, it's tipped like way completely over into the gangs, the gang leadership. But we're seeing that like final moment of like civilization, and that is like depicted on screen. The kind of from the very first shot, I think the very first shot is the gateway, the archway to the halls of justice, and some of the letters are like half hanging off. Later in the film, we'll see inside the halls of justice, and they are so decrepit and derelict, and there's just like crap on the floor, and like all the windows are like half shattered. It's clearly shot in an abandoned building, but to like set your center of justice in a derelict building says an awful lot about what's happening to the society. It's a great like little way of queuing that up and showing you how everything's broken down almost.
Yeah, and that sign really reminded me of like whenever you see Arkham Asylum in sort of like any sort of Batman media, it always looks a bit like that. It looks a bit creepy. And I think the idea of Batman and Gotham is very similar to sort of what you see in this and in Dredd. It's kind of got that comic book nature to it. You've got a sort of a vigilante who's still working with law enforcement, and the world is anarchy and he's trying to put it to rights.
Yeah, and Arkham Asylum is a particularly good example of that. It's a really twisted inversion of a mental facility. It's on paper it's a place where people with serious medical conditions would go to get help, but of course it's a barbaric treatment of the absolute worst criminals in the DC universe, and no one's getting any help there. And half the time, in half of the stories, it's being run by the criminals themselves or deeply corrupt institutionalists. So yeah, that's like a good similar representation of the institutions of a society crumbling and breaking apart.
And this institution, the Hall of Justice, is crumbling apart, isn't it? You've got all of these cops sort of, they're trying to do their jobs, but it's getting harder and harder to do because everything's on the rise. Like there are these gangs which are wandering around and they can basically do whatever they want because there's no repercussions really, because the justice system is flawed in this society. They can just get off of any charge with like half a decent lawyer, but it's like there's more to it than that, isn't there? It feels like the law enforcement don't have the power to stop these criminals without using these violent methods.
Yeah, they're stretched too thin, and that's where the kind of the geographical landscape comes into it. A lot of this film is set in open, incredibly flat, incredibly empty rural spaces with maybe just one stretch of road going through them that we'll see a car chase bombing down. And you've got the MFP. I think we only see between 6 and 8 MFP characters at the most.
What does MFP stand for? Because they refer to them as a couple of things as well, don't they? They call them the Bronze as well because of their badges.
Yeah, so it's Main Force Patrol, and they're basically like what you would think of a Highway Patrol police team. They're basically that, but But Highway Patrol complements other types of police forces, and they all work together. And we don't see anything other than the MFP. They seem to be everything that's left of a policing system.
Yeah, that's better than when we looked at Conquest of the Planet of the Apes and it was the Ape Patrol.
Yeah.
This is a slightly better named patrol.
There's something about the name as well. I like the name Main Force Patrol. Again, because like they're Highway Patrol, but they're the main force. That it's in the name. And also, I don't know, there's something about like main force that complements the kind of petrol head nature of the film. Like clearly George Miller was very, very interested in directing a lot of exciting car chases. This is a petrol head movie, and largely a petrol head series as well. Maybe the third one not so much, but there's a lot of that in the Mad Max films, and clearly it's a big interest of George Miller's visually. So yeah, the kind of Main Force Patrol, I feel like that's a good name for such a petrol head team of law enforcement officers.
Yeah, because this film is so visual as well. I mean, it has to be, it's a film, we always say that, but in terms of sort of like what it's doing, there's not loads of dialogue and it's not very dialogue dependent. It doesn't set up its world through that kind of way. All of the storytelling is done through these scenes and how we see the characters. And I know that George Miller was he wanted to make a real, I think the words he used is kinetic film, and he was watching things like Buster Keaton and all of that kind of stuff to try and sort of get that sense. And it made me think about, obviously, modern times when we looked at that, and it was like Charlie Chaplin telling this dystopian story with just images and just sort of like the visual elements. And this is kind of like, again, it's another dystopia being told through action scenes and just this kind of like this feeling of what's going on, because you get a lot of feeling from this film, but it's not through the dialogue.
Yeah, and I think that George Miller really... he definitely does that in this film. Totally. It's a very kinetic movie. He's done an incredible job of that. I think that quote and that explanation really goes a long way to explaining like what Fury Road is. Because I've seen all of these films. I love these films. I've seen them a few times, but I haven't seen any of the first three since I saw Fury Road. So this is the first time going back to the first one. And Fury Road is an incredible movie. I loved it. And I was surprised to see how much of Fury Road is in this first one. And I need to watch them again, but I don't think the second and the third ones are quite like that. I think there's quite a lot of car chases and stuff in the second one, but this is mostly car chases. And obviously Fury Road is almost entirely car chases and unbelievably elaborate car chases at that. You know, he's really getting to just like spread his wings in that fourth film. But you can totally see the DNA of it in this film. And not just in the car chases, but like a lot of that flowery dialogue from Toe Cutter and Knight Rider, you know, that's very Immortan Joe and the War Boys in the fourth film. Of
course. And I mean, Immortan Joe is played by Toe Cutter, isn't he? Which is another lovely touch, just sort of like bookending those two.
I think he's the natural choice. Having rewatched this and seeing how Toe Cutter is, and I'd forgotten exactly what a great character Toe Cutter was. Like he's absolutely the right choice for George Miller to call back in for the fourth one.
Oh, without a doubt. And I mean, let's talk about the gangs then, because all of the population of Australia in this film are living in fear of these violent gangs which could roll up to your town at any given moment. And it's something quite Western about that as well, isn't there? Sort of like these bad guys are going to just like rock up to town and they're going to cause anarchy and they're going to do whatever they want and nobody can stop them. What did you think about sort of like the gangs?
There's a definite Western feel. The second movie is like entirely a Western movie. He's a Clint Eastwood character who arrives in a town and helps them out, solves their problems, and then leaves. This is more that's going to a place and like getting rid of the besieging entities. This is the revenge kind of Western. I gotta hunt down my man, and I'm gonna go across whatever terrain and stuff. There's a lot of the Western in it, and again, borrowing from American filmmaking, I think that he's doing there. But the gangs are like brilliant. Like I was saying, like Toe Cutter, he's an amazing kind of head figure, but they're all very well cast and very believable in the roles, aren't they?
Yeah, and they're quite eclectic, aren't they? Because all of them are just like, they're just scary individuals, and everyone's sort of got their little quirks. You've got the like Toe Cutter's right-hand man, Bubba Zanetti, and he's this really sort of stoic character who's kind of like trying to keep the gang in order, it seems, although he doesn't do too much of that. And then you've got the younger guy, Johnny the Boy, who is just off his face on drugs for the majority of the time, just doing whatever he wants and not really knowing what's going on. And then you've got like the Knight Rider as well, who was like a member of the gang previously. So there's so many like dangerous characters, but they all have their own sort of personality to them as well. And just when they sort of like turn up, you feel the fear, don't you? Because they're so, you don't know what they're going to do. There's this spontaneity to them, and that makes them even more dangerous.
Yeah, I think they could have been quite faceless, couldn't they? It's quite easy to fall into a fairly faceless gang and one charismatic leader. Whereas in this, you've got those 4 or 5 performances there standing out from the rest of the gang as 4 incredibly nasty pieces of work, but very individual nasty pieces of work with clear traits and personalities that come through and make them even more scary, because they're much more dangerous when they have like different reasons to be scary, and it's not just Toe Cutter and a dangerous mob doing his bidding. Yeah, the Bubba being all stoic, he's got this like simmering menacingness to him, hasn't he? And then you've got Johnny, because he's high all the time. That's a risk of pure chaos in everything he does. Like he's a wild card even within the gang. Like he causes problems for the gang because he's the one that Goose catches up to first. Is it Goose? One of them catches up to first. Earlier in the film. So yeah, there's extra danger and threat because those characters are so well fleshed out, I think.
But it's also the fact that they all know each other and they are part of this group, and it's the group mentality of having all of these crazy, horrendous people just all working together, and they all know each other. So like when the Knight Rider is killed, word gets back to Toe Cutter, and then there's sort of like there's repercussions which you know are going to happen somewhere down the line in the film, but you don't know when they're going to happen, you don't know how they're going to happen, and it's just all of that kind of stuff just makes it so much more menacing, because also you've got the law enforcement in comparison, and you've got them as sort of like this group, but you can already see that they're struggling. They haven't got the budget for stuff. They're sort of putting together cars with whatever bits and pieces they can find, and yeah, they can't even do their jobs. Like Goose gets so frustrated when Johnny the boy is released, and you can see sort of like the pain on his face, because Johnny the boy and all of his cronies they've raped this woman, and they've done horrendous things, and there's just no way to get them in prison. There's no way to stop them. The only way they can stop them is on the roads.
It's really interesting, that scene, isn't it? Because it happens quite fast. It's quite fast paced, that scene, and the specific thing happens off screen, but a trial has taken place, hasn't it? Or there was some attempt to have a trial of Johnny, and like I think a lawyer or a representative of the MFP is explaining that like no one showed up, the witnesses didn't show up, there was no case. They just had to let him walk free. That's how they can act with impunity. Is this presumably this level of threat is so great that no one will ever testify against them. But there's that scene's so frantic and desperate that it just feels like it's not as simple as like, well, witnesses were intimidated. It's like it sounds like the trial itself just broke down and disintegrated. We're still doing these things. We've got officers who arrest people, and then there is a process. They go on trial. Like the ideas kind of still exist, but clearly it's all disintegrating, and a trial couldn't even really get off the ground and happen. Yeah,
because something's happened to the society, hasn't it? That means people don't fear any sort of repercussions from anything, and they've lost. They don't feel like they have to obey the laws of this world now, because they're either like angry or crazy, or feel like there's nothing that they can do. It feels like all of that stuff's in there, yet you've still got these people in these towns just living normal lives. It's kind of like there is something going on in the wider world which is making people lose it a bit.
Yeah, and you're saying like people getting on with their lives in those towns. I really like that aspect of this first film, that like some things look so strange, like the derelict halls of justice. Like this doesn't look like a place of business for a law enforcement agency, but then Max's home looks incredibly normal and quaint and idyllic, and the farm they go to visit, some of the scenes in the towns that we see, they're very like, they seem quite out of the way towns. But, you know, for a sort of relatively small-ish Australian town, they look nice, they look normal, apart from the fact there's like a violent gang tearing through the middle of it. It looks like the real world. And obviously that's the DNA of Miller's interest in originally depicting it in the contemporary 1979 Australia.
And that's the DNA of sort of like dystopian fiction as well, isn't it?
Of
because
course,
it's like
yeah.
It's that near future, isn't it? And making it like that is sort of like makes it much more interesting. And I think there's something to be said about sort of the way that Max is living as well, because he's got this really clear divide between his work life and the world that he's associated with then, and his sort of personal life and his home. So his home is on the outskirts of society. It's like it's by the beach, away from everybody else. And the other places we see are a little bit more built up, but they're kind of like they're smaller towns still. But there's something, because we always talk about in dystopia sort of how do you escape a dystopia? How do you get away from it? And it's almost like Max is trying to do that by living away from everyone. And he's trying to keep this piece of normality from himself where he can sort of raise his child and live a happy life with his wife. But it sort of seeps in, this dystopia seeps into his life. And because his job is becoming more and more sort of prevalent in what he's doing, and it's becoming more dangerous as well, it doesn't end well.
Yeah, that separation as well. I think there's something in when he goes on his rampage at the end of the film, he goes back to get his revenge. One of the first things he does is he goes into like his garage or his shed or something, and his MFP leather uniform is in like a chest. It's in storage, but there's something about him returning to that and like the MFP officer versus Max, the guy with the wife and the child. The guy who just saw his wife get murdered by the gang couldn't go and seek revenge. He needs to put on that outfit and become the MFP officer and go back into that brutal dystopian society that he is a function of as an MFP officer. That's the only way he's going to be able to get his revenge, because Home Life Max separates that out and he lives away from all of that and tries to just be happy.
Hey, Max.
Go ahead.
We are 100% snafu.
You okay?
Nothing the air and the traffics wouldn't fix.
Much damage?
You should see the damage, Bronze, huh? Metal damage.
Brain damage, huh? Are you listening, Bronze?
I am the Night Rider. I'm a fuel-injected suicide machine.
I'm a rocker. I'm a roller. I'm a controller. I'm the Night Rider, baby. I'm a dude, and we ain't never coming back.
He's got this sort of like divide, but all of the people at the station in the Hall of Justice kind of see him as the top dog, the hero. And the station master makes a big thing about how no one believes in heroes anymore. And he wants Max to be this kind of this hero that people can get behind and can sort of like rejuvenate the force, basically. But there's still something in Max which is holding back from that. He doesn't see himself as a hero because he thinks if he carries on doing this work, he's going to become more and more like the gangs himself, because he's got that sense of one day I could just go overboard, and then where's the line? Where is the line between what's right and what's wrong when you're enforcing the law with these methods that you have to use to sort of catch these criminals?
Yeah, and it's interesting the way they dress. That outfit that I just mentioned that he puts back on, the outfit of the MFP, they look like a biker gang, don't they? They're dressed in leathers, white t-shirt underneath. They look like a 1950s like greaser gang, don't they? So they are, everything's just clinging to these remnants of institutions, but it's all falling apart in favor of gang warfare, basically, and the MFP's not too far away from that. You mentioned this idea of him being a hero as well. I thought it was really interesting that his boss says that line, like, what does he say? Like, there's no heroes left anymore. People need heroes, something like that. Yeah. Implying that Max is a hero. But then he just cracks up immediately, doesn't he? He can't even say that with a straight face. The idea of them being heroes is laughable to both of them in that moment.
Yeah, because you think about stuff like the chase scene at the beginning where there's a child who gets on the road and they're still going at full speed, aren't they? There's no sort of like effort to try and save the kid. Yeah. They're still just catching the criminals, aren't they?
Yeah, they're quite inept as well, aren't they? Specifically those guys in that first chase scene that end up tearing through town, particularly the first two that we see. One of them's called Roop, the kind of fat one who's like perving on a couple having sex down the scope of his rifle. And then he's got a partner who is quite childish. Like they have a squabble over who should be allowed to drive. Again, that kind of that petrol head mentality. Petrol's running out. Driving is a privilege that they get because they're MFP officers. So they squabble over who gets to drive. That is not taking the situation of Knight Rider seriously, having a squabble over who's going to actually be in the driver's seat. There's ineptitude there and childishness in those MFP officers. Not so much in Max, obviously.
And that childishness is in the gangs as well, isn't it? It's quite an interesting sort of like contrast, because the way the gangs talk is kind of like, it can be a little bit childlike as well, can't it? Because the way that they refer to stuff, and there's something sort of like they're always just playing around, and it's quite juvenile, some of the stuff that they're doing, because they're just working off impulse the whole time.
Yeah, there's a lot of quite childlike slang, but we've seen a lot of slang in dystopias, haven't we? The way that language breaking down can represent a facet of society and civilization breaking down. But again, the MFP have their share of slang as well. There's like a memorandum on the tannoy telling them not to use the word bronze. They're not supposed to call themselves bronze. It's derogatory. They call the gangs scoot jockeys. You know, they've got all these little bits of slang as well. It's not just the villains who've broken down language and are degrading in that way. Again, it applies to the MFP as well.
And it's also like this tribal thing as well, which we've seen before. So like you've got the two opposing sides and sort of, and how they conduct themselves. I mean, the fact that the gang is nomadic as well, and they make such a thing about that because they're free to do whatever they want, and they can go wherever they want, and they can just rock up to these places and just sort of take over for a bit and then go off onto the next place. And there's no one to control them, whereas the sort of like the law enforcement are trying to control everything all the time, but they're fighting a losing battle because it's just getting more and more out of hand, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's where I see the kind of post-apocalyptic tropes coming into it, because in post-apocalyptic films and TV and stories, society has already broken down, and then new societies begin to form, small societies, and they have their own rules and they can do what they want. And Toe Cutter's gang is not there yet because the MFP is still there trying to keep them in line, but they are trying to break away. They are getting to that point where the control over them is fading away, and they want to break free from society and just recreate civilization in Toe Cutter's image, I guess. I
think there's something to be said about like the methods that they're using as well, because it gets increasingly violent throughout. I mean, it starts off with that amazing chase scene, which is really full on. You've got like cars flying all over the place, and they're properly, it's like it's all real action. And I think they couldn't have got away with doing those stunts now, because health and safety would not allow half of the shit that's happening in this film. It's absolutely mental. They've got people crashing through boards, and they've got like that van which flips around. It's
one
mad.
of the bikers, when he first when Max first attacks a group of bikers in the final sequence, one of those bikers gets hit by the wheel of a bike in the back of the head.
Yeah,
I saw that, and weirdly, that was the thing that stood out to me as the most violent, because it really looked like, well, a man has been clocked in the back of the head with a flying motorcycle wheel. I'm sure he's a stunt performer, but that's going to hurt a stunt performer as much as anyone. It looked really bad.
And I mean, yeah, because that's really happening, which adds that extra sort of element to this. And I think because all of this was happening at the time with the sort of like oil crisis and stuff, I think that must have made it even more imposing to audiences when you're watching it, and then on top of that you've got these other violent scenes, which now you look and you see they're staged. Obviously you've got but they're still really harrowing. I mean, Goose's death when he's getting burnt is just like, it's horrendous, isn't it?
Yeah, and what I was saying before about Mel Gibson's reaction to horrific events when he pulls back the blanket on Goose in the hospital. That shot of Gibson's face is amazing. There's so much horror in his eyes. It's really good. I don't think we don't see Goose then, do we? We see Goose's hand before that moment, but we never actually see what Max sees. It's all on Gibson's face, isn't it?
Yeah, we never see him again after that. And I mean, he's sort of like, you grow to love Goose as well through the film, because he's sort of like, he is Max's best friend. They're joking around. You see he's got like more of a personality than some of the other people on the force.
And he's good at his job. He's not inept like Roop and the others. You know,
Yeah.
he's as good as Max, really. He's the motorcycle equivalent of Max, yeah.
This is a threshold moment, Johnny. Step through.
Carter, this isn't what I want.
Light it. Bronze. They keep you from being proud.
Look at him. Looks silly, doesn't he? Upside down.
Do it for freedom and the night.
I can't.
Throw it.
No!
You scum-sucking trash.
Throw it! Throw it!
So seeing his death is really full on. But I think obviously the big moment in the film is when you see Max's wife and child get killed. Well, Max's wife survives just, but I mean, it's not for very long from the sounds of it. It's just so horrific.
Yeah, it's grim, and it takes ages to happen, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's the build up, isn't it?
I think most of the second half of the film is building up to that point, and specifically there's like a back and forth where she's being chased, followed. You think she's going to get away, all of that. It's weird for me because in my memory, this film was a lot more revenge. That's the bit that like really sticks with me but then watching it back, it was like the last 15 minutes, like when he actually like puts the suit back on and goes out to get them. That's the more memorable stuff. But yeah, it doesn't happen until right at the end of the movie, does it?
It's more about the sort of the trauma of living in this society, isn't it? And having to do the things that Max is having to do like day to day, just sort of trying to enforce justice on these gangs which are out of control, but just seeing it sort of seep into his own life. And the sort of like the thing about it is Toe Cutter wants to get revenge on Max, but that's not why this happens. That's not why his wife and kid are killed. Like, they just happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And then this could be any family. It just so happens that it's Max's family that get caught up with the gang. And just seeing how they react when, like, his wife is just trying to get an ice cream, and then they start following her. And I don't think they never realised that it's Max's family, do they? Until later when Max starts going after them.
No, I think you're right. They've got this vendetta against Max. Well, it's more against Goose because of Goose's interaction with Johnny earlier in the film, but they kind of obviously they hate all of the MFP. But yeah, none of them see Max until after he goes back out looking for revenge, I think, right? Because the Jessie and the old woman escape the farm, and then she gets run over, and then they're long gone by the time Max shows up to find Jessie.
Yeah, because that makes it more tragic as well, doesn't it? Because Max is trying to live this life away from everything, but he can't, because whatever happens, it's going to find its way into his life.
Yeah, literally the whole point of the holiday was to give Max just a breather away from the brutality of this specific gang. Obviously, like it's a brutality in society that has been grinding him down for some time, presumably. But specifically, Toe Cutter's gang, his boss sends him on a holiday just to unwind and get away from them for a little bit, and then just another of that gang's random acts of violence targets his family and completely ruins his life.
And I think it's great that this film is focusing in on this particular story and not trying to do too much in terms of, like, you could have more world building in this, but I don't think this film needs it, because you're in there in the moment the whole time, and just sort of like you're experiencing their reality as they are almost, because it's all just shown through sort of like how they're living their lives. So I think that makes it scarier and more sort of relevant as well in a lot of ways, because the idea that this could happen to anyone in this kind of world makes it just more terrifying.
That's the kinetic filmmaking, isn't it? Placing you just in that moment and making you feel it more than anything. But it's just got, because it's just a series of car chases, basically exciting car chases and violence. But it's just got that perfect little peppering of the dystopian law. You know, it has been thought about. Toe Cutter's gang stealing the petrol from the lorry, the sign saying you're entering a prohibited zone with no other explanation. That stuff, I think that's the stuff that makes a cult classic, right? Because it's an exciting, fun movie. It's brilliantly directed action, but that just dropping in those hints of a more interesting society and the halls of justice and all of that stuff. That's what sparks people's imaginations and gives it a real life.
Yeah, and I think just the way they set up the character of Max as well, and sort of like how they sort of develop him throughout the other films. It's this story which sort of sets it all up, isn't it? It's this idea of what society was like just before the collapse, just before things completely got even more fucked and you're living in a desert with crazy people and leather everywhere. It's setting all that up, but it's doing so because it could have just been like a normal police cop chase film, couldn't it? With just like a gang. But the fact they've got all of these dystopian elements makes it just adds something to it. And also just seeing Max's descent into madness. I don't know if he's properly, like, he's not crazy, but he's mad. He's angry at what's happened. And when he's no longer got those things holding him back, the idea of having to enforce the law, he just goes crazy and just he's all about like revenge at that point on.
Yeah, and you can contrast that to the scene where the trial falls apart. Goose goes, he's Mad Goose in that scene. He wants to just enact revenge and, you know, his own form of justice. I mean, that's implying that like justice was, you know, he disagrees with justice, but justice like failed to be conducted at the trial. So he just wants to, you know, take revenge for Johnny's crimes with violence. And Max is the one holding him back, amongst others, but specifically because Max is Goose's friend, he has to pin him against a wall to physically restrain him from doing that sort of thing. And then, you know, Max just gets to his own point that Goose got to halfway through the film, where he no longer wants to be restrained in that way, and he just wants to, you know, use violence to get rid of these people that are terrorizing civilization.
And then we just see that like become a cycle again, don't we? Like we see in so much dystopian cinema, it's just a vicious cycle of things repeating themselves, and just it's just going to go on and on. But Max is becoming this character where, because he doesn't have these laws, he can use the methods that he needs to sort of like wreak his own sense of justice on these people. I mean, in the other films, you do see sort of like, you see his moral compass, like you see he's still got it, but there is something about sort of having to survive in this world as well, where there's no big societal like governing force implementing sort of how things should be. There's no sort of like, there's no real law. There's no real sort of like consequences for stuff. So yeah, so in this, it's just like Max is having to take it into his own hands. Yeah,
he's just no longer able to work with these degrading aspects of society, and he eventually just gives up on that. But he's still got some sort of moral compass that points him to, you know, if he's given up on society and he doesn't believe in it anymore, I guess he could just go around murdering people like the gang does. But he takes out that rage on the gang. He's directing that rage in this sort of this morally justified way, at least in his own mind. And that, I think that continues in the other films, doesn't it? He's always like a reluctant hero. He's a bit like chaotic, and you've sort of got to point Max in the direction of the bad guys and he'll sort it out, kind of thing. That's what crops up. But he's never villainous. He's always got that he's always got that heroic aspect to him. It was a joke between him and his boss when that was brought up, but that is the compass that guides Max through all of the films. Like he broadly just he's angry and mad, but he'll direct that at the bad guys.
I think we're also seeing sort of like Max's dehumanization as well. Definitely. Because he is so human in this film, isn't he? Like, I forget how much of a sort of it's not loads and loads of personality, but you do see his personality, the way he's living with his family, and you see all of that. And then once that's taken away from him, then he becomes this new person who we know through the other films. Like, he loses a part of himself, and he loses his connection to his emotions, because he has to just cut them off, doesn't he, in order to survive after this.
Yeah, exactly. And we've seen that time and again, haven't we? That's what we've been looking at all throughout the series so far, is the way a dystopia will dehumanize you. And that's exactly what happens to Max. He the different characters have different breaking points, but he reaches his breaking point, and it enables him to commit horrible acts of violence at the end of the film.
And it's interesting that it's not like a totalitarian government putting this sort of like this dehumanization on people. It's just happening because there is no government. So you're seeing sort of like a different kind of dystopia through that. Like, there is a government in this, but it's not taking control at all. So anarchy is becoming the new norm, and you're seeing it just spiral out.
But in that loss of control is this kind of increased power and authority given to police officers to become increasingly violent, and we'll see that. We'll definitely see that in Dredd. That's what Dredd picks up on, that kind of thread. But in Mad Max, like I said, like, you've still got the idea that they will all be held to account and have their day in court and all of that, but it doesn't work. And then I think their boss says something like, as long as the paperwork's all good, you can do what you want out there. You know, they are encouraged to be incredibly violent on the road. So I don't know, there are aspects of a totalitarian state there. Like, it's losing control, but as it loses control, that grants more power to the police to just be more violent, to try and cling to that control. And that's what we see in the MFP.
Well, I think that's a good point to talk about our next film, Dredd, from 2012.
So, James, we were just talking about Mad Max, a film based on the idea that petrol was running out in Australia in the late 1970s. It really reminded me of the recent petrol crisis that we had in this country at the time of recording. I mean, that was a few months ago. Do you remember that? The prices went way up.
Yeah.
And the prices are still high. It's very expensive to fuel your car. Now, on the subject of that, listeners, we've got a Patreon. I've got to put petrol in my car. I just want to take a moment to talk to you about the fantastic content that we've got on our Patreon, patreon.com/journeythroughsci-fi. You can head over there and sign up, and for £4 a month, you can get all our bonus episodes. We've been doing it for nearly a year now, right, James? We've got loads on there.
Yeah, it's creeping up now, isn't it? Yeah, there's lots of content on there. We've got stuff on the latest Matrix film. We've got our Planet of the Apes series, which we're doing over there, where we're covering all of the previous Planet of the Apes films. We've got an abundance of stuff on there. There's TV show reviews, there's crazy film things, and we're always open for suggestions as well. So if you come along and become a patron, you can interact with us, and then you can help shape the content we're doing over there, and indeed on the main feed.
Yeah, we're going to be wrapping up that Planet of the Apes series soon, and then we might be starting a new one, so you can have a say on what that series might be. So come over and join us. Once again, that's patreon.com/journeythroughsci-fi.
800 million people living in the ruin of the old world. Only one thing fighting for order in the chaos. The men and women of the Hall of Justice.
Peachtree's is the manufacturing base for all the slow-mo in Mega City 1.
You know how often we get a judge up in Peachtree's?
Well, you got one now.
Okay, so on to our next film, Dredd, 2012. Director Pete Travis. James, judgment?
Is it Pete Travis? This is the
Good
debate,
question,
isn't it?
yeah. So it's produced and written by Alex Garland, and Carl Urban has gone on record in an interview saying that basically Alex Garland directed this, which I think you can see, can't you?
Yeah, I mean, it's very good, so I can see that Alex Garland's involved in some way.
Well, Pete Travis I don't really know a lot about Pete Travis. He could be a fantastic director capable of making a brilliant visual movie like this. But there's some stuff in there that looks quite Garlandy, especially post-Annihilation. Some of the use of colour is very, very reminiscent of Annihilation. So perhaps that's Garland's touch there, maybe.
That's a really good point. And Garland sort of like has his kind of signature stuff, doesn't he? And that just reminded me one other quick thing about Mad Max. George Miller has done some crazy different films, hasn't he?
Yeah, it's quite hard to reconcile George Miller's filmography because he hasn't done many films. Most of the films he's done are Mad Max films. 2 of them are Happy Feet films. And then there's a smattering of dramas in there.
And there's Babe Pig in the City
and
as well.
he produced the first Babe film as well.
Mad. It's mad what these writers and directors end up doing. But on the topic of Dredd, you've got Alex Garland, he's on writing duties for definite. We know that. Like I said, there's a question mark about whether he was the director. Carl Urban says he was. Pete Travis is attached. But anyway, that's all by the by. Let's talk about this world of Mega City 1. So this film is based on comic book characters again. It's based on the popular comic series Judge Dredd from 2000 AD. Now, this sort of like this world it's proper dystopia, but it's got like post-apocalyptic elements to it in a similar way to sort of Mad Max with sort of the desert area. But in this film, we're shown a world where like there's 800 million people living in this mega city with mega blocks and mega highways. And I think that's pretty much the intro speech that Carl Urban gives. Everything is mega. Everything is packed out with people.
Yeah. And then it's an incredibly small story, isn't it? Told within that mega dystopian setting. This film is, famous for being like a very small story and basically the same story as the film The Raid. It's just one siege, 2 characters trying to make their way through one big tower block and get the bad guy who's at the top. It's like a video game plot, isn't it?
Yeah, but I think that's perfect for this as well, because obviously we saw in the previous Judge Dredd film with Sylvester Stallone, when you've got too much in there, it doesn't always work for this character. That film was a bit sort of all over the place, but I think by keeping it all about Dredd and his character and just sort of like showing us this world, I think it's just like it makes it more of a cult classic and has more longevity as well, because it works in a similar way to Mad Max. It's telling us this story of this law enforcement officer, and we're invited into his world and we see the chaos that he's working with. And I think that's what's so fundamental about this, is by keeping it small, we're shown like a day in the life of this dystopia.
Yeah, it's a great first movie in a film franchise that never got any more movies. I think there's still some possibility that it's going to come back somewhere somehow, but as we said, it's been 10 years. That's a long time in filmmaking. I hope they do make more. But yeah, telling that small story, the day in the life of the cop and the rookie officer who's thrust into this world at the deep end, that's such a simple but classic storytelling method to get an audience surrogate into the film and throw you in at the deep end as an audience member as well as Anderson's character.
Yeah, because you're on side with Anderson. You're seeing this world through her eyes, and you're being introduced to this menacing character of Judge Dredd, and you're seeing it all through there, aren't you? But why is the law needed in this society as well? Because we talked about how it's so packed. There's 800 million people living in this city, which is just like a sprawling city.
It's a mega city.
It's a mega city. It's like they need some people to enforce the law, but it's that one step further though, isn't it? Because things like, if you imagine sort of crime in a normal city and then crime in a mega city, it's going to be a bit more.
It's going to be mega crime, James.
Mega.
What I was struck by was that comparing this to Mad Max, like it's visually, it couldn't be any more different really to Mad Max. But the core kind of concept of what's going on in the nature of law enforcement that is incredibly similar. In Mad Max, it's like you've got about 8 MFP officers covering what seems to be an enormous expanse of rural Australia, and that's why they're stretched so thin. In Dredd, it's basically the same situation, but mapped onto this mega dense city, Mega City 1. And then the judges have exactly the same problem that MFP have. There's too many people, there's too much crime, there's not enough of them, and the landscape that they have to cover is absolutely enormous. So they're faced with the same challenge as the MFP.
But I think the difference is that they have more authority to dish out justice, don't they?
Yes, absolutely. So he says in the opening narration that they are judge, he reorders it, jury, executioner, and judge. But that's the really interesting difference, isn't it? Because whereas we see that trial scene, which I found so interesting in Mad Max, where they're still trying to separate that out. There is a judge somewhere. If he will be executed, then that would be dispensed somewhere else. But in Dredd, we're just rolling that all into one. But what's interesting is, like, from a dystopian point of view, I think that makes the judges more effective. The MFP are really struggling to hold on to things, but the judges are brutal and horrible, but undeniably quite efficient when they get to a crime. Well, efficient's the wrong word, isn't it? Because he says they only deal with 6% of crimes. But, when they get to a crime, they deal with it. Dredd certainly does.
Yeah, they know their job and they know what they've got to do. So they have to dish out this justice, don't they? They have to basically just decide on people's sentences when they see them, and it's all down to them. And you're being introduced to this, like we said earlier, about through Anderson's eyes. So you're seeing her on her training day as well. She's learning all of this stuff as we're learning it, and it's this. I think the setup of having it be about a rookie and a veteran is really great as well, because that Dredd is going to get the job done, whatever happens. And that Anderson is going to have to sort of learn why he does the things that he does and how best to operate in this crazy anarchic world.
Anderson also gives the film a more interesting moral compass. I think that, I don't know, like, have you read any Judge Dredd? I've only seen the 2 films. I don't know any Judge Dredd beyond that, really.
I've read some of it like years and years ago. I remember sort of like there's so many different tangents it goes on, but I was quite familiar with sort of like the characters. Like you had, I think it was Mean Machine, who was like this guy who lived in the outskirts, like it's the kind of like exploitation kind of thing going on with him and his family, and they're all inbred. And then you've got like Judge Death, who was like a really interesting character as well, who later came into it, who was a bit sort of like, I don't fully understand what it was. It was a bit over my head when I was younger, but he looked cool. And again, like, just talking about the characters now, there's so many different things they could have done with this film. And I think Alex Garland had written a few different sort of demo scripts, which were doing like big story arcs that happen in the comics, but he looked at them and was just like, no, I can't do that for this film. It has to be stripped down. It has to be this sort of training day.
Yeah, well, it is like training day.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I don't know how Dredd's characterized in the comics. I have to assume that in the decades that it's been going, there's quite a lot of backstory and characterization there. But specifically in this film, I don't find him a likable character. He's robotic. He's a robotic, blunt instrument of the law at best. At worst, he's this, ultra-violent maniac with a gun and an authority to do what he wants. The importance of Anderson there is to have a much more likable protagonist. Like, she's the one who can sort of actually show nuance. There's no nuance to Dredd's application of justice. Like you were saying, like the judge's job is to make a judgment then and there, and then, carry out the sentence. But we get specific instances where, like, Anderson can read someone's mind. She reads Domhnall Gleeson's mind. And admittedly, she only does it because she thinks she's not going to be a judge. But she applies her own justice, which is like, I actually know there's extenuating circumstances here. I'm going to let him go. That's something that, like, could literally never happen for a judge who wasn't psychic. Like, Dredd had already said, like, if you're an accessory to Mama, you're all dead. That's the punishment, and I will be killing you. Because there's no trial, because no trial would happen where Domhnall Gleeson could put forward his case about this is what they did to me, blah, 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 he'd be dead. Like, there's absolutely no nuance to Dredd's application of justice, and I think Anderson is so much more likable for that reason.
And also because with Dredd, you don't see his face. You just see all Carl Urban's acting is his mouth and his voice. So that's all the insight you get into him and who he really is. I mean, when I first watched this, I didn't know it was Carl Urban until I saw it afterwards.
I don't think I clocked it first time I saw it either. But he wasn't a huge star, really.
Yeah, I think his star sort of like...
He'd been in Star Trek. Yeah, he'd been Bones for a couple of years, but I didn't know him for much else apart from that.
Yeah, and all of his voice acting in this is kind of like, it's grim and... Like you were doing the impression earlier, it's exactly like that, like gruff and rough and ready. And he apparently based it a bit on Dirty Harry and Clint Eastwood. Yeah. So, and I think that really comes through as well. And this kind of like this almost, this unlikable character, but the fact that he's got his helmet on, and then Anderson, you can see all of her facial expressions. It's that dehumanizing element as well. It reminded me of RoboCop as well, because like with RoboCop, when he's got the visor, he's just a machine doing his job, dealing out like law. He's dealing out law enforcement and judgment. Whereas when he's got his like visor off, you see who he is and you see his face. You never get that with Dredd, and that makes him more menacing and more unlikable as well, because you can't get a gauge on him because he is just this machine of law enforcement.
Yeah, and it dehumanizes him again. Yeah, definitely. And RoboCop makes so much out of that, the duality between RoboCop and Alex Murphy, and there is nothing else to Dredd. Certainly not in this film. That's why, I'm sure there's more to it in the comics or whatever, but this film really just focuses in on him as this monolithic robotic character that just brutally dispenses justice. Now, all of that said, I find him deeply unlikable and all of that. I really like watching him. This is a great film. It's a huge amount of fun, and Anderson being the kind of moral heart of it kind of makes it much more forgivable that he's such a dick. And also you get those corrupt judges as well. They throw the corrupt judges in there as well, just to let you know, like, Dredd's definitely a good guy. There's worse judges out there.
I guess he's kind of just doing what he can. But you've also got the criminals in this. I think they're given more sort of like a human nature as well. There's one scene where you see where Anderson like makes her first kill, and she kills one of the gang members, and then they later run into the gang member's wife when they're hiding out, and you sort of get this sense of the people that are part of Mama's gang are actually people as well. So like there's a reason that they're doing these horrendous things, which you didn't get as much in Mad Max because they all seemed a little bit off the rails and a bit crazy. But I think that there are elements of this where it's like, what has driven these people to join this gang, and how much was it their decision? Like with Dom Null, he like you see his character and you see that he doesn't want to do what Marmar's making him do. So you get another sort of sense of a human nature to these criminals, which are otherwise sort of seen as just this sort of black and white vision of what is good and what is bad.
Yeah, and in a similar way to what we were saying about Toe Cutter's gang kind of trying to separate themselves from society and establish their own brutal order, Mama's done that. She's taken over this entire block, and because the judges are spread so thin, there hasn't been a judge in this building to do anything about it in an untold amount of time. She's been able to essentially establish her own society in which she is she's queen, basically. She's the autocrat of it.
And there's a lot of comparisons between her and Dredd as well, because she's like the antithesis of Dredd, isn't she? Because she's very sort of like, she uses all this like violence, but she's very sort of like free and easy and spontaneous. Like you look at the first two scenes where you see sort of like the introduction to Dredd when he's on his motorbike and he's like, he's dealing out justice. But when you first see Mama, she's in a bath getting high. So you've kind of got this weird contrast between the two of them as well. Like they're both vicious, but in different ways.
And you see that again in her when the guy brings Anderson to her and they're all like gathering around her, and she just very calmly says, no, you're not going to do anything to her. Here's what we're going to do. That similarity to Dredd is like the violence, yes, but also like a single-mindedness and a laser focus and a total calmness throughout the violence. Like they both have a clear goal in mind. They are completely unbothered by anything else, and they will deal untold amounts of violence in order to achieve that. It's just that she's, purely self-serving, whereas Dredd works in defense of the law and in service of the people and the society, nominally, supporting all of that. That's the core difference, but their behavior in achieving those things is very similar.
Citizens of Peach Trees. This is the law. Disperse immediately, or we will use lethal force to clear the area.
Where's that coming from? Over there. Access corridor.
You have been warned.
This is Mama. Somewhere in this block are 2 judges. I want him dead. Until I get what I want, the block is locked down. All clan, every level. Want the judges down.
Everyone else clear the corridors and stay the fuck out of our way until the shooting stops.
I suppose you get a bit more of an insight into Mama's past as well, though, don't you? You see that she was like a prostitute, and then she was like attacked by her pimp, and then she decided to use all these vicious methods, biting off the guy's cock and just getting more and more violent and then taking control. So she was like, she could have been a victim, but she chose not to be. And it just spiraled out into her being this boss of this crazy drug cartel almost. And the fact that she's uniting all of these gangs as well. Like she's bringing all of these violent groups together. And I mean, I love the idea of the different gangs. Again, we've got this kind of like tribal thing that's going on. Like they've got like the ones which stick in my head are the judged.
One. Yeah,
just because, because the tattoos they've got. All of these kind of like, these groups are just joining together in this one apartment building. And you said it's like the Raid earlier, but so Peach Trees, the block is like, how many people have they got in there? It's like 700,000 or something mad.
Do they say the population of Peach Trees itself? It's 200 stories, 200 floors, and we see roughly the size of it. There could easily be 50 to 100 people per floor, I suppose, couldn't there?
Yeah, I think they say 75,000 people in one
yeah.
block at one point. So and also like just the fact these people are living their lives in this block, where you see like a few little, like, they're not even shops at the bottom, are they? There's like a dispensary of some kind. And like in my head, it was like there's like a job center and stuff like that. And then that's it. And then the rest of it is just all flats. But then they've still got like a skate ramp. So I can only imagine what else is on these floors. But it just looks like a really like crazy apartment block.
Yeah, well, not that crazy though, is it? It's not that. I mean, it's functionally similar to real world blocks of flats, isn't it? Like you'd have a small number of facilities on the ground floor of a block of flats. There's a medical center in this one. I don't think you'd get like doctors normally, but you get like pharmacies or whatever. Like that's fairly common. Like that, all of that seems quite realistic. Having like the skate ramp on like the side of the building, like 100 stories up, is a sort of interesting flourish. But having a skate park sort of within the grounds of a few blocks of flats is very normal, isn't it? It's not so far away from the real world, I think. It's just mega.
Yeah, it's just mega. But it's no different to having like a basketball court or like a football bit or something like that. There's so many places like that, but it's just because it just seems surreal at the same time. It's like that on a much larger scale, and then you put that many people together, and there's poverty as well, isn't there? Because you see a few of the flats, and then so they're all very different. Like some of them are nice, and you've got like families living there, but then others are really derelict, and you've got like people getting high, and it's just this entire contrast of this weird sort of ecosystem that's being created in Peach Trees.
Yeah, you've got the whole world there basically represented, but all under Mama's control, isn't it? That's the whole thing. Whether people are living in poverty and turning to crime, or they're just turning to crime because they don't want their family to get murdered by the rest of the criminals that are there. That's what the woman, you know, when they break into that woman's flat for refuge, she just wants to get rid of them because if they go to another floor, then they're less likely to kill her husband who is hunting them down on that floor. You know, it's all just like they have no other choice than sort of living this life because she's imposing that control on all 200 floors.
Yeah, because how else are you supposed to survive if there's no judges half the time? You have to sort of find your own way to get by, don't you? And one of the ways people are getting by is using this drug as well, this drug which takes such a sort of a center point of the film, this slow-mo, which is like responsible for so many epic scenes. It does get used quite a lot. When I was watching it again this time, I was like, oh, yep, here we go, slow-mo again. But it's a great device. It looks great on screen.
I loved it. I mean, I thought it was amazing. It's like a key element of the visual characteristic of the film. And when I was watching it, I didn't know the thing about Alex Garland possibly having directed it. But my first kind of thought, because I was thinking about like, oh, why was there never a sequel to this? I remember it being good. And my first thought when the slow-mo kicked in was I remembered all of that and that visual characteristic. And I thought one problem with a sequel here is that you can't just do slow-mo again, but you need to have an equally interesting visual hook in the next film. Otherwise it will look plain by comparison. You have to do something interesting with it that gives it its own unique visual flavor. Otherwise it's not going to be as good as of a sequel. And that's where I think you can see Alex Garland as well as the director. You know, it's something that I think he's capable of doing from seeing his other films.
That's a really good point, because the slow-mo as well adds to that sort of comic book nature of it.
Definitely.
Because some of the slow-mo scenes, they look like frames from a comic book. Like as it's happening, you're seeing it in that sort of way. And even just like the sound as well, the way that it's being sort of like the sound's being manipulated. Like I think quite famously there's that meme which says the slow motion sound effect that they use is based on that Justin Bieber song that someone slowed down 800 times. And it was all over the internet.
I'm not familiar with
Again, this is 10 years ago now, so it was all over the internet back
10-year-old
then.
memes.
But yeah, you probably weren't listening to Justin Bieber, to be fair, Matt. So that was like another sort of interesting thing when it first came out. But it just creates this really crazy soundscape of everything just being, well, slow, but it's just impressive the way they've got it all together.
Yeah, it's great. It's a great visual drug scene. Like drug scenes, there's an infinite number of ways of making it look interesting. And the slow-mo just works really well. It's a fairly like simple idea, isn't it? Like the drug makes you perceive time a bit slowly for a bit.
It makes it sci-fi as well, doesn't it? Because
yeah.
It's a weird futuristic drug that's slightly different, like Synchronic or something like that.
And it has all these different applications in the film as well. Like it is used in lots of different ways. It's obviously it's a drug, it gets you high and you can experience that in slow motion, but then like the criminals can use it as an extra level of cruelty, you know, when they're committing violence. That was really horrible, you know, when they throw those guys off. That she does that to make a statement about her control. The statement is the same whether they were slowed down or not, I suppose. Like it's not necessarily going to become public knowledge that they were on slow-mo. It's actually a waste of the drug. It's just done for utter cruelty and violence.
It's just malicious, and it's adding fear though as well, isn't it? Because like everybody in her immediate circle knows that is one of the things that could happen if you cross Mama, so it just adds again to her notoriety.
Yeah, definitely. And then that also allows obviously for the payoff that the villain gets her just desserts and is punished by the same methods that she used at the start of the film. So you've got that element to it as well.
Toss him over the balcony.
Hit him with a little slow-mo first.
Sure.
Thinking about sort of the slow-mo stuff as well, I suppose the other sort of visual effect they do a little bit is the psychic powers and how they show Anderson's sort of the way she sees these visions of what people are thinking in their head. But they do an interesting thing when when Wood Harris, who plays Kay, is sort of trying to keep back his information from Anderson. And they do this weird sort of sequence where she's in his head, but then he's trying to imagine crazy things and stuff. And I loved all of that in there as well. It just made the psychic powers just a bit more visual.
Yeah, the psychic powers are a fun little comic book element, I think, in this film, aren't they? Apart from that scene where she goes into his mind, most of it is just a little sort of pulsing flash that tells us that she's having a little psychic moment. I actually really appreciated that. Because, hey, let's just give a quick shout out to the fact that both these films are an incredibly tight 90 minutes. I love it. And they're both fast paced. They are so much fun in 90 minutes. I love that in films. And I just really appreciated that with the psychic powers, it was introduced quite early. We're told she's a psychic. She's sitting in that room and she's asked to say something about Dredd on the other side. It just does that little bright pulse. So now we know a bright pulse on screen means she's doing something psychic. So we just rattle through it. It doesn't disrupt the pace of this film, and that's key. That it's such a fast-paced film. So we've just got to get on with it with the psychic stuff. She's going to lean against a wall. It's going to glow, and then she knows something. Boom, we're in it.
And there's that amazing moment when you see one of the corrupt judges, and it's the female corrupt judge, and she's like, oh, when I see her, I'm going to shoot her first. And you're thinking, well, she's psychic, so... And it's little moments like that, which are sort of queued up so excellently. It just really builds up the anticipation of what's going to happen next.
Yeah, those corrupt judges are such a great tool in the film, aren't they? Not just to make Dredd seem better and nicer, essentially. It's that video gamey element of it. This is the best video game film, even though it wasn't based on a video game, the bad guys level up as we get later into the story, and then you've got to face harder bad guys before you get to the boss. So it can't just be endless thugs. Dredd's just going to dispatch as many thugs as you throw at him. Well, we're going to throw 4 judges at him. Now that we've established how badass the judges are through Dredd, let's throw 4 bad judges at him, and it just levels up that kind of difficulty setting of the action.
Yeah, and I mean the machine gun scene as well, when they've got it's not even a machine, it's like a chain gun or something crazy, and it's moments like that are just so, they're ramping up the tension. But then it's interesting seeing what Dredd's going to do next, because he's got his magic gun as well, which can do all of this crazy stuff. So he just said, when he says hot shot, and then he does that crazy shot in that guy's mouth.
That's really cheesy, isn't it? That moment.
It's just bits like that. I was worried it was going to be lots of dialogue like that, but luckily it's not too much. But yeah, and then when he's he's incendiary shots that he's just raining across the balcony onto the cronies on the other side. It's moments like that are so exciting, and it's so action packed. It's just a lot of fun.
It is an awful lot of fun. The gun as well, and also his motorbike at the start of the film, because it's not really in it for the rest of the film, but he's got a Knight Rider bike. And I mean Knight Rider, the TV series, not Knight Rider from Mad Max, but all this technology that the judges have with them, it's another it separates it from the Mad Max kind of situation where the MFP are literally scraping together parts to build Max a nice car, whereas the judges have the full force of the government of Mega City 1, which is a population of 800 million. There's a lot of money there, and it allows them to have all of this wonderful technology, wonderful gadgets. It's very comic booky, but it allows them to have more control over the population than the MFP would, who are much more scrappy and more like a gang. But the villains are also able to utilize and weaponize that technology, aren't they? That's the whole point of Domhnall Gleeson's character. The building's so high tech, and it can lock down and all of that on the outside and various levels, but the villains are able to capture that technology basically and invert it and use it for their own purposes.
Yeah, I think the whole idea that they've been able to take over the block by locking it down, and even just tricking the judge, sort of the judge HQ, into thinking that it's just a sort of a routine check or something like that. It's so it's showing the power that they have in the society to be able to just do something like that. They are top of the food chain in Peachtree's. Like, they are in control. But then there's something to be said about the fact that it just takes Dredd and Anderson to be able to overthrow them all and just take it all down. It's this weird sort of like dynamic between the two of those things.
Yeah, and the gang is using like the tools of the dystopia, aren't they? It's an oppressive level of control that's built into the buildings, literally control and also surveillance. You know, we see the sort of we see like CCTV sort of images in the opening montage that introduces the Megacity 1. They're just utilizing these tools of the dystopia and using them to their own ends. But yes, you're right. Send a judge in, one badass judge. That's enough to. It doesn't matter how much power you've got over the technology. Judge Dredd's just going to rip through you with his magic gun.
Yeah, you're right. It is interesting seeing them sort of take the place of what we would see in other films as the sort of the government with their sort of surveillance and them sort of taking ownership of that in this building and then having that sort of flipped on its head a little bit. I think there's something really interesting about that. And I mean, even though they've got all of these cameras on them and they're trying to throw up all these roadblocks, they still can't stop them, can they? They still get to the top floor in the end.
Yeah, you can't stop Dredd. He is an unstoppable object. He will kick, punch, and shoot his way through any obstacle, won't he?
Yeah, he's not someone you'd invite down to the pub, is he?
Yeah, I don't think Dredd goes. God, that's one of the things I'd love to see in the sequel is just any aspect of Dredd out off the job. I don't expect to see his face, and I fully expect him to behave the same way, but it would be interesting to see him at the end of the working day, you know?
Yeah, he's just down the pub. He's just down Spoons, isn't he? Getting a pint of Foster's.
I don't know. I imagine he just reads like legal textbooks and stuff.
Oh my God. He just polishes his gun.
Yeah,
and his shoes and his helmet.
Big time polisher, I think, this guy. Yeah.
Polishes his helmet. Oh, Jesus.
Anyway,
enough of Dredd's personal life.
Blast their way up, and and like I said, he gets to dispense the same punishment to Mama that she meted out cruelly to the criminals earlier. I have to say I was a little bit disappointed with that because, you know, I was enjoying like Anderson being the more nuanced one, and when Mama's got that tracker, the dead man switch basically attached to her to measuring her heartbeat, and Dredd just says, no, the law's the law, like punishment is death. I thought that the climax was going to be that Dredd has to make like a more nuanced legal decision and has to and when he shot her in the stomach, I forgot how it ended, but even when he shot her in the stomach, I thought he might have shot her in the leg or something, and that the idea was that like he was going to take her in and, you know, he was going to have a workaround that meant that he wouldn't just dispense the death penalty. But no, he does have a workaround, but the workaround is something that allows him to dispense the death penalty. And it's kind of like risky. He's like, well, I don't think the tracker's going to work a kilometre distance, so I'm going to kill you.
Absolute gamble.
It is a gamble, isn't it? And I was a little bit disappointed that he didn't have that moment of maturity or character development, whatever you want to call it, where his time with Anderson has made him realise that there is nuance to being a judge that he doesn't appreciate.
But that's not the character, Matt. The character is an arsehole.
He is an arsehole.
He is like, the long arm of the law, which is going to come and get you.
Yeah. I suppose that you do get a little bit of that from Dredd in the denouement, where his boss asks him, did Anderson pass? And we've been, you know, it's been made explicit that she's failed. He had some very clear rules. She even says, I lost my primary weapon. I know this is done for me. But I guess there's that moment where like Dredd's acknowledging that the nuance that she brings to the role will be more valuable than her failure to, you know, pass the basic tests.
Yeah, and it's her journey as well in the film, because she's grown. Because when you see that first scene where he says, are you ready? You don't look ready. And then you see her just before the sort of like the final fight sequence, and she looks like a badass, doesn't she? She looks like she's ready to go. She's got like a bloody machine gun. She's all sorted out. You're right. It is just that last moment where you see a bit of Dredd's kind of personality.
I don't know, like just that he's learned a lesson, I think, isn't it? Like
he quite likes that she's a bit rough around the edges now.
I think that well, he basically he breaks the rules, doesn't he? There's very clear rules about her passing and failing. They've already been broken a little bit because she failed out of the academy, but you know, he's bending or breaking the rules for her. I think ultimately, like, you know, he is still incredibly black and white, and he's seeing that she will be an effective law enforcer, an effective judge. So he's weighed that up, and but he is definitely making a slightly more complicated decision in passing her than just his normal behavior, which is there's a set of rules and I enforce them, and there is nothing more to the world than that.
She did save his life as well, I suppose.
I don't think he cares about his life though, does he? You know.
Yeah.
He when he's asking her what the options are, and she's like, well, we either hunker down and hide or continue to try to escape, and he's like, well, the third option is we go and kill her. And she's like, is that an option? I think we'll definitely die if we do that. He doesn't give a shit. Like, you know, judgment.
He's ready.
Yeah, judgment must be dispensed. He's going to go up there and kill her.
Yeah, he's a stern policeman.
Stern policeman, yeah, to say the least. It's a great movie, though, isn't it? But both of these films are really fun. I remember that, like, when we watched Demolition Man, I had like real problems with the kind of propaganda element of Demolition Man. And
propaganda, that's brilliant.
I've
not heard that.
I didn't coin that. That's a kind of an existing term.
Damn.
But I was a little bit worried going into both of these movies that there would be elements of that. And I think both of them, I mean, Mad Max, like the point is that like he's given up on any attempt to be a good cop and he just becomes violent. And Dredd, I think it's all on Anderson really to make it more interesting and more forgiving of Dredd being such an asshole, basically.
Yeah, it's not celebrating this police brutality that they're doing in this, and it's making the criminals like it's to do with the societies that they're in as well a lot more. Like I know it was the same with Demolition Man, but there is just something that makes more sense in these two films. It's not just I don't know what it. Yeah, it's just like there's less of those layers which make it quite iffy.
Yeah, I think society in Dredd does celebrate Dredd's violence, and the film celebrates violence, but I don't think the film celebrates Dredd's violence. Is that fair to say? Like, you know, the violence is just so fun. It's a violent movie, and it's a movie that clearly celebrates how fun violence can be on screen when it's done well. But there's enough depth there that it's not just sort of allowing Dredd to be this character without there being more to it. And I think that's really, really deft direction from whoever directed this movie.
Whoever it may be. So dystopian law enforcement, what are we thinking now having seen Mad Max and Dredd? Like, you've got these crazy worlds full of violence. These two, like, members of the law are having to really use violence in order to try and control it. But it doesn't work, does it still?
Yeah, I think there's just like no escaping the violence of a dystopia, is there? Like Max finds that and he removes himself from the law enforcement profession, whereas Dredd just exists in a society where his violence is necessary and celebrated and makes him actually really good at his job. But dystopias just create that level of violence and you can't avoid it. You either realise that you're the bad guy, like in Equilibrium and Fahrenheit 451, or you just go down an increasing road of violence, I think. So I think that's all we've got time for on these two films. I've really enjoyed watching these two films. Crazy violence. I mean, what's not to like? two great characters, not always very likable. Great fun, right?
Yeah, a great couple of violent films to go off of the back of our last episode on Rollerball and Death Race 2000. Yeah, we like to keep the violence coming in these dystopian episodes, but we have more violence in the form of our next episode. Can you believe it, listeners?
Yeah, it's been a chaotic few weeks, but it doesn't stop here. Next week, we are returning to the idea of dangerous games once again. Whereas last time we were looking at volunteers in those dangerous games, next time we're going to be looking at mandatory dangerous games where you are signed up and you must play. What are the two films we've got next week, James?
So next week, we are looking at The Running Man from 1987 and The Hunger Games from 2012. And we have a special guest as well joining us, don't we?
Yeah, we're very excited to be joined by Rob Watts, the host of Kvikmindapod. I hope I'm saying that right.
Glad you said it, not me.
Well, Rob can educate us on how to say the name of his podcast next time. So please do join us for that. That's going to be really exciting.
Yes, please do. And you can listen in to me struggling to pronounce Rob's podcast.
But in the meantime, if you want to get in touch with us, as always, you can send us an email at journeythroughsci-fi@gmail.com, or you can find us on your social media of choice. Just search our name and I'm sure you'll be able to find us. We have a Facebook discussion group in particular that you can come and join and come and chat about the films that we're talking about on the show.
Yes, and if you want to chat with us even more, if you can't get enough of the chat from us, then you can also join the Patreon and you can talk to us on there, and you can also get access to all of the bonus episodes we have up on there. There's content in abundance.
But if you don't want to join our Patreon and you still want to support the show, that's absolutely fine. You can leave us a review. That's always helpful. If you leave us a 5-star review, it's also helpful if you leave some text in the review. That helps with the arcane magic of the algorithms. So leave us
the arcane magic.
So leave us a 5-star review, and why don't you let us know in the text what Dredd's like when he's off the clock? I gotta know, and I don't want to read like 30 years of comic books, guys. Just tell me, is he interesting or is he a weirdo?
Yeah, and don't put your answers in the form of what happens in the previous Judge Dredd film. We're not having it.
Doesn't count. Anyway, that's all for this time. Join us next time.